Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host Tony, and today is episode 100, which means it is time to rank our Year 2 Pantheon entries. This is where we take a look over every game that we've looked at over the past year, and we determine what are the top 10 Pantheon games from Year 2 of this podcast. This is a little bit of a different episode than what we normally do. I always get excited for these. I mean, this is the second time we've done it, but I am super excited to go through the ranking, see how my notes compare to your notes, and see what we all determine is the top game of Year 2. We're going to talk about all that in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode 100. I am super excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show, whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis. I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. This is normally the part of the episode where I go over the anatomy of an episode, where we talk about the fact that we talk about the history of the game in question, then go into a pseudo review where we talk about the graphics, sound, music, narrative, and or story, if the game has one, playability and controls, and overall feel before reaching a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today, with the top of the top being in the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. Then the golden oldies, which are not quite Pantheon worthy, but are really close. Mediocre mentions, where we start getting into the games that I cannot recommend to the broad game playing population because might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple issues to begin with, but you may still have a good time. And then we get to the footnotes, where I can't recommend anyone play those titles. Well, today we're not going to do any of that, because today we are going to review our Pantheon entries from Year 2. Just like we did last year, we're going to go through all of the games that made it into the Pantheon, and then we're going to rank our top 10 and count down to the top game of Year 2 of Classic Gaming Today. It should be a good time. I truly am excited to do this episode because I love ranking episodes. I love ranking different games and kind of seeing how they fit in with each other. And sometimes it's a challenge to rank different games across different genres. I mean, who's to say that a first-person shooter can compare the same as what you would play in a point-and-click adventure game? And how do you really do that? It can be a bit tricky, but we're going to do it anyway. So with that said, we are going to get started. First, though, I do want to mention each of the games that are up for review this particular episode. So these are the games that made it into the Pantheon of Classic Gaming for Year 2 of Classic Gaming Today. And these are in chronological order. We have The Secret of Monkey Island, Resident Evil, Adventure Island, Desert Strike, Day of the Tentacle, Duke Nukem, Full Throttle, Mega Man 2, Super Mario Bros. 3, Beneath the Steel Sky, Kirby's Dream Land, The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, Pilot Wings, Broken Sword, Shadow of the Templars, Castlevania, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, Monkey Island 2, LeChuck's Revenge, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, Earthbound, Virtua Racing, Nights into Dreams, Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Conquest, Blast Corps, and Serious Sam: The First Encounter. Those are the 24 games that we will whittle down to our top 10 as we go throughout this particular episode. One quick note though, you'll notice that EverQuest, which was our Nostalgia Trip episode, is missing from this Pantheon list. The reason it's missing is because we didn't actually go back to play it because it has changed so much over the years, but just for completeness sake, EverQuest is absolutely part of my personal Pantheon. That being said, it will not be part of this top 10 episode. So with that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the top 10 Year 2 Pantheon entries. We're going to start with number 10, which is... Mike Tyson's Punch-Out is a game that I have played a ton of over the years. I remember playing that game as a kid and trying to get as far as possible. I even remember a couple times getting up to Mike Tyson, though I never did beat him back when I was younger. He was just too fast, too vicious. I just couldn't get past him. So when I decided that we were going to look at Mike Tyson's Punch-Out for this podcast, I entered into the episode with a little bit of trepidation because I knew what I was getting myself into, but also a lot of excitement because I remember having a great time with the game when I was younger, and I was really hoping that it still held up today. Well, I can safely say that it absolutely did hold up today. It is truly a classic for a reason. Now, the thing that struck me most while playing Mike Tyson's Punch-Out is when I was younger, I always thought of the game as a traditional boxing title because, well, it is a boxing game. You're supposed to box a bunch of different opponents. You're supposed to get through those opponents and claim a lot of championships and eventually go up against the whole champion of the entire game, which, of course, is Mike Tyson. But as I played it today, I recognized that boxing, the whole concept of being a boxing game, is really just the paint over top of what the true mechanics of the game are. And those mechanics are actually very puzzle-ish centric, but also memorization centric. It is entirely pattern-based. You need to figure out how to both observe all of the opponents that you're facing, memorize the patterns associated with their different movements and combinations, and then counterattack when appropriate in order to make your way through the game. Now, the thing with Mike Tyson's Punch-Out that makes it so addictive is the fact that as you go through the game, the difficulty truly does ramp up. And where you're facing Glass Joe at the beginning of the game, and you have to maybe recognize 2 to 3 different moves, all of which are very slow and easily punishable, you're thinking this is going to be a walk in the park. And then by the time you get up to Mr. Sandman and Mike Tyson, you start thinking to yourself, this is going to be impossible because the game really does ramp up. But it has such a smooth difficulty ramp that it really does feel like you are getting better. But this is not just a traditional boxing game. This is not a boxing game in the style of, say, the later Fight Night kinds of games by Electronic Arts, where you're supposed to truly pummel your opponent into submission. In Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, it is all about pattern recognition, pattern memorization, counterattacking, and solving the puzzle that is each individual fight in the game. And solving that puzzle and emerging victorious is an amazing feeling. Mike Tyson himself still remains one of the harder challenges in gaming, simply because of the first 30 seconds of that fight, where he will literally randomly punch you and knock you out with one hit. If I were to levy any complaint against Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, it would be for that first 30 seconds of the Mike Tyson fight, because all of the cool things that you have been recognizing up to this point, all of the patterns you've been memorizing and recognizing, all of the way you've been kind of figuring out how to counterattack appropriately, it kind of goes out the window with that first 30 seconds of the Mike Tyson fight. Now, I know there is a tell as Mike Tyson is beginning to wind up his uppercuts. There is a very, very, very split-second tell. And if you get proficient enough in the game, you can actually react to that and truly beat Mike Tyson. You see that all the time on speedruns or other kinds of really high challenge feat kinds of gaming where people just basically make Mike Tyson nothing. Well, that's not what happened to me. I did finally beat Mike Tyson, but that was definitely an uphill battle. But what I do want to mention is because of the fact that Mike Tyson's fight in particular really does require split-second timing, a lesser game would basically be impossible. But the way that Mike Tyson's Punch-Out was designed was to have controls that felt so good and so perfect. You hit a button and there is no perceptible lag in your input versus what you see on the screen, which is imperative in this game because if that didn't exist, there would be no way you'd be getting past later fighters. Even playing on modern kinds of technology with emulation, I didn't notice any real lag. I know some people complain about that kind of thing online, but I didn't really notice it. It felt like a one-to-one representation of what I input and what I saw on the screen, and it really didn't feel like there was any lag between when I actually put my input in and when the action occurred on the screen. That is what makes this game so special. Not just the mechanics of trying to figure out the puzzle that is each fighter, but the fact that the game gives you the controls needed to truly be effective and to actually overcome all of those challenges. And for that reason, or those reasons, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out is number 10 of our list of Pantheon games for the last year. We're going to move on to number 9 now. That is... Serious Sam, the first encounter, completely surprised me. Not because I didn't think it was going to be a good game. I had always heard good things, but I never played Serious Sam, any of the Serious Sam games, before I sat down to play it for the podcast. What I had heard was that Serious Sam was an over-the-top action experience, unlike most first-person shooters, or actually, I guess, more like the older school first-person shooters than what the first-person shooter genre had really evolved into, with more of the narratives like was driven by Half-Life and other games like that. So when I sat down to play Serious Sam, I was expecting an action-oriented experience. Well, what I got was a ridiculously over-the-top experience. I have never played a first-person shooter with as much visceral, frenetic gameplay as Serious Sam the First Encounter. Now, the fact is that Serious Sam does something that no other first-person shooter, at least that I'm aware of, was able to do successfully, and that is fill the screen with so many enemies that you literally, if you look across the battlefield, all you see are a wall of enemies, sometimes literally jumping and crawling over themselves. It's kind of like the scene in, what was the movie? War Z, I think it was, with Brad Pitt, where there's one scene where there's a bunch of zombies that are trying to climb a wall, and they literally climb over themselves and kind of make this gigantic moving ramp of zombies to try to get up the wall and get to the people they're trying to presumably eat. That is kind of what it felt like to play Serious Sam the First Encounter. There are sections of the game where you will be absolutely overwhelmed by the number of enemies on the screen. And the thing is, it never slows down. Now, granted, I did play the game on a modern machine, so it's possible that on a period correct piece of hardware, it would slow down a little bit. But everything that I read actually indicates that the engine was designed so well that they were able to display all of these creatures on the screen at the same time without any appreciable slowdown. And that is something that was truly unique. And like I said, I don't remember ever playing a first-person shooter with this much action and these many enemies on the screen at one time. That is really the thing that I remember most about Serious Sam. I mean, the weapons were all great, the level design was fine, everything about the game was quality, but the thing that puts it over the top, and the thing that makes it one of my more favorite first-person shooters of all time, I honestly think that's true. I think it is one of my top first-person shooters now, is the fact that you face overwhelming odds and you have to overcome those odds even though you're literally being attacked by hundreds of enemies at one time. I don't remember another game that was able to do that except, of course, the Serious Sam series, which I haven't played any other than the first, but after playing the first, I absolutely want to get into. Moving past Serious Sam at number 9, we are now going to reach our 8th spot on the list, and it is the very first Resident Evil title is a game that has captured and enthralled me from the very moment it was released, and I still remember the first time I played the game. My brother and I were going to stay the weekend at our aunt's house, and we decided, wouldn't it be great if we could rent a video game system and rent a couple games and play them while we were there? Back then, we didn't own a PlayStation, and you could also rent the modern, for the time, consoles from various video and gaming stores like Blockbuster Video. So we decided, let's do that. So we went over to Blockbuster Video with my aunt. We rented the Sony PlayStation, and we rented 2 games to go along with it. One of those was Twisted Metal, which is an awesome game by itself and will definitely be a topic of a future episode at some point. And the other was Resident Evil. So we got to my aunt's house. We plugged in the PlayStation to the TV. We fired up Resident Evil and were greeted by the best full motion video cutscene to ever begin a game. I know some people might be thinking I'm being ironic because the quality of that full motion video sequence has acting that might be considered questionable. But the fact is, back then, it felt revolutionary. The quality of the FMV, and I'm talking about the technical quality, it was so clear. It felt like watching an actual movie. It wasn't grainy like what you would see on the Sega CD or a lot of the computer games of the time. It was perfectly clear, and it felt like I was seeing the future. And then you get dropped into the mansion and you get to start exploring and you get faced with all of these different creatures that fill you with dread, all of these different puzzles that you have to solve, all of these different keys you need to find in order to progress further into the mansion and uncover the game's mysteries. I was hooked that entire weekend. I was addicted to Resident Evil. Fast forward almost 30 years. And playing Resident Evil for the podcast gave me the same kinds of feelings. Now, obviously, looking at Resident Evil today versus what it was back in the mid-90s, you can see how there is some aging here. The tank controls, which I know not everybody loves, but I personally don't have an issue with. But you have the controls. You have the graphics, which are 3D graphics, or at least 3D with some pre-rendered graphics that, yeah, they're showing their age a little bit, especially the character models. You have some gameplay decisions that probably a little bit more old school than what most modern gamers will enjoy. And you also have voice acting that is, oh, it is so cheesy. It is, but I love it. I absolutely love the cheesy factor. The cheese factor of Resident Evil and the voice acting there. Wow. It is like one delicious, cheesy Jill Sandberg. Oh, wow. That came out wrong. No, what I mean is that it is just so good in so many ways. The voice acting is so bad, it is good. And everything else about Resident Evil, honestly, is still remarkable even today. There is a reason why Resident Evil has had an entire series of sequels and spin-offs and remains one of the top franchises in all of gaming and has been incredibly lucrative over the years. It is because that very first Resident Evil experience was designed so well and captured the hearts of so many gamers that it continues to be relevant even today. And Resident Evil, if you sit down with it and you decide to give it a fair chance, and you go into it recognizing this is not a modern game, it's going to feel a little bit older to play, Resident Evil is still a remarkable experience, even in its original PS1 glory. It is still an amazing game to play. I had a ton of fun playing it for the podcast. I can't speak highly enough about it, which is why it is number 8 on our list of Pantheon entries for the last year. Moving on to number 7, we now have Some of you are aware that I am a very big point-and-click adventure gamer. Adventure games are probably one of my, if not my, most favorite genre in all of computer and video gaming. I love sitting down with a good point-and-click adventure game and trying to solve all of the game's puzzles, hopefully without a walkthrough, because I really do try to do that for the most part. I feel like that sense of getting a puzzle yourself correct and actually figuring out what the designer wanted you to figure out, that's a feeling that I absolutely love. So I love sitting down to solve the puzzles. I love sitting down to experience the narrative. I love exploring brand new game worlds and interacting with interesting characters. Everything about the point-and-click adventure game genre, I truly, truly love. And because of that, several years ago, I had started a podcast, separate from this one, obviously, that was called Point and Click and Adventure Game Podcast. And in that podcast, what I would do is something fairly similar to what we do here, in that every 2 weeks, I would play through a different adventure game, I would capture some thoughts around the history, and then I would do a talk-through kind of section, which was effectively like a Let's Play, albeit in audio form and condensed, and edited with all of the different game music and things like that. It was kind of a unique take on how to present an adventure game to everybody from an audio kind of format. Now, that took a ton of time to do, and which is why the format is no longer being used for these episodes. Plus, I don't like to give spoilers anymore. I don't want to give spoilers for anybody who may want to play the game, so I haven't been doing that. But anyway, I relay all of this information to say that the first time I played Day of the Tentacle was actually for that point and click podcast. I had never played Day of the Tentacle back when it was originally released, despite hearing from many, that Day of the Tentacle was probably one of the best adventure games of all time. Back when I was younger, was always a Sierra guy. My brother and I think I've told this story a couple times before, my brother was always into LucasArts adventures. I was always into Sierra adventures. So what we would do when we would get a new adventure game, depending on if it was Sierra or LucasArts, if it was Sierra, typically I would control the action. I would sit there at the computer. I would be the one controlling the mouse and interface and whatever else needed to be done for the game. My brother would sit by me and we would try to play those games together. If a game didn't have voice acting, we would voice act out all the scenes because we were just that awesome, and we would try to solve the puzzles together. So as an example, Gabriel Knight 1. Sins of the Fathers. We didn't have the talkie version. We had the floppy disk version, which meant no voice acting, which meant we had to voice act all of that stuff in the game. I had a ton of fun being Gabriel Knight, by the way, but regardless of that fact, I would control it for that. For the LucasArts side, my brother would do it. So games like The Dig. Now, The Dig did have voice acting, so no voice acting there. Oh well. Anyway, we would play those. He would play those and control those. I would be off on the sideline and I would kind of give my own perspective or thoughts about the game and how to solve the different puzzles and all that kind of stuff. I mention all that to say that Day of the Tentacle, for some reason, totally passed both of us by. So I never played Day of the Tentacle back when it came out. When I did my Point and Click podcast, I did play Day of the Tentacle. And what I discovered was that everything that everybody said about the game was entirely true. This is truly one of the finest point-and-click adventure games ever made. It has that traditional LucasArts level of polish that raises it above nearly every other adventure game that's out there. Not everyone, because there are some that I consider to be quote-unquote better than Day of the Tentacle. But the fact is, Day of the Tentacle is one of the best adventure games of all time. The way the puzzles are designed with the multiple time periods and the fact that you can do something in the past and influence the future. The way that all of the puzzles are chained together and dependent on one another creates an experience that I remember the first time I played it was absolutely mind-blowing. Playing it again for the podcast this past year, I had the same kind of experience. My only regret is that I couldn't play Day of the Tentacle for the first time again, because I did remember some of the puzzles. Actually, I remembered a good chunk of the puzzles. There was one I still didn't remember. I mean, it wasn't really even a puzzle. It was more of an observational thing. There was one I still didn't remember when I played through it this past year. And I just think to myself, why didn't I remember that? I wonder if when I play it again in another couple years, I'll forget it again. Regardless of what may happen in the future, though, Day of the Tentacle remains one of the best adventure games of all time. If you, like me, haven't played it or you hadn't played it up until now, go out and play it. I encourage you, definitely go out and play it. You could play either the original or the remastered version. I played the original for this podcast. I played the remastered version for the Point and Click podcast. Both of them hold up incredibly well. Both of them are awesome. If you don't care about experiencing the true original, just play the remaster because it's arguably the better experience. It has much more smoothed out graphics and audio, and it has commentary included, which is awesome by itself. Day of the Tentacle is one of those point-and-click adventure games that I will never, ever forget. And it is one of those games that when you first start playing it and when you start experiencing it, you recognize that all of the hype you've heard about it over the years is 100% true. And it is one of those games that will likely never be forgotten or avoided again. It is simply that good. Moving on from our 7th entry to number 6, we have Super Mario Bros. 3 is a special game to me for many different reasons. And once again, just to relay a little bit of a personal story. Back when I was in the 3rd grade, I had gotten fairly sick. I had pneumonia and I had enlarged adenoids, which had to eventually be surgically removed. So as I was going through all of that stuff, the one game that kept me going through all of that. And granted, it wasn't like a horrible, horrible illness, but as a third grader, man, it really sucked. But the game that really kept me going and kept my mind kind of focused on something other than just feeling like crap was Super Mario Bros. 3. And I had decided that before I went in for my surgery, I was going to beat Super Mario Bros. 3. So I spent so much time, and I was home from school at this point. Like, I was way too sick to go to school. So I would play Super Mario 3 day in and day out until finally, the night before my surgery, I finally beat the game. And I remember thinking, this is one of the best games of all time. That's what I thought back when I was in the third grade. When I sat down to play Super Mario Bros. 3 today, I kind of thought to myself, I wonder how much of this is going to actually hold up, because there have been incredible advances in the platformer genre. We have so many good platforming games today that have refined controls, and even the platforming games that are not considered all that great, most of them have fairly responsive controls and have some really unique mechanics. Super Mario 3 is kind of the genesis of all of that, because if you look at platformers before it, you had games like the original Super Mario Bros., which was pretty much a very straightforward platforming experience. Still an incredibly well-designed platforming experience, but it was very straightforward. It didn't have a ton of bells and whistles. It was basically taking the act of platforming and distilling it down to a very foundational core set of capabilities, which of course makes sense because it is one of the earlier platform games ever created. Fast forward a few years and you get Super Mario 3, which was probably the biggest evolution in the platforming genre ever up to that point. No, not probably. It absolutely was the biggest evolution in the platformer genre up to that point. Sitting down to play it today, I can safely say Super Mario 3 still deserves its reputation as being one of the best platforming games of all time. All of the different unique power-ups that you can get, all of the different overworld activities that kind of add some additional flavor to the experience, like going to the card matching shop to maybe get some extra lives, the Hammer Bros encounters, the special airships that can sometimes appear, the different hidden mini games that can sometimes pop up, all of that, not to mention the diversity of the different worlds that are throughout the game, makes for an experience that literally is probably one of, if not the best NES game of all time. For an 8-bit title, Super Mario 3 is almost unmatched. Even comparing it to other later generation titles though, Super Mario 3 still holds a high place in our overall ranking and in my personal ranking of video games of all time. It remains an engaging experience even today. One of my favorite platforming worlds in all of platforming gaming is from Super Mario 3, which is of course the world where you are small and everything else is larger than you. When that came out, when that first happened, if you were alive when Super Mario 3 came out and you were playing this on an NES, and you got to that world where all of these enemies that you were used to seeing as kind of smaller sprites were now gigantic on an 8-bit NES system, you kind of thought to yourself, this might be some sort of technical wizardry at play. It was unlike anything anybody had ever seen up to that point. And playing Super Mario 3 today, I still kind of got a little bit of that sense of wonder, even though I know that there are so many more technically advanced games that blow Super Mario 3 out of the water. Certainly, from an 8-bit perspective, this is one of the more advanced titles, but there's been a ton of great games over the years that certainly are, from a technological perspective, way more advanced than Super Mario 3. What I'm telling you is that it doesn't matter, because all of the mechanics in Mario 3 come together in addition to the world design, the overall power-ups, the just sheer whimsy and feel of playing Super Mario 3 is a feeling that is very hard to match and is one of those feelings that for me will always have a spot in my heart, and that is why it is number 6 on our list of Pantheon entries for this past year. Moving on to our 5th entry, we're entering the top 5. I wonder how everybody's notes are comparing to mine. We have at number 5... when I was young, my brother and I developed a little bit of a bad habit. We would go to the video game rental store, and a lot of times we would rent an RPG. And to just put it into perspective for anybody who didn't have the experience of going to these video rental stores and actually renting video games, when you walked into one of these stores, well, first of all, the overall video game market, the number of games out there was not nearly as gargantuan as what we have today. A lot of times consoles, they had plenty of games available, but depending on where in the console cycle you were, either more or less games would be out there to potentially purchase. And the thing is, when you're a kid, you don't have a ton of your own money to go out and purchase games. You have to rely on family and parents and all that kind of stuff. So when you wanted to play a game, but you didn't have the money available to do that, to actually go out and buy a game, and you didn't have anything saved up in order to go out and potentially get something, and you didn't have some sort of event coming up like a birthday, the only way you could play these games would be to go out to a video rental store and rent them for a period of time, because you didn't have the internet, you didn't have the ability to quote unquote emulate anything, and beyond that, at that point it would have been highly illegal because these games were modern for the time. So when you wanted to play a game that you didn't own or that you didn't have the ability to purchase, you had to go out to the video rental store and hope that the rental store, number one, carried the game, because it wasn't like the video game rental stores had unlimited stock of all of the different games for a given system. And you also had to hope that nobody else had rented it. When it comes to RPGs, my brother and I were pretty into it, and for similar reasons to why we were into adventure games. A lot of times we'd get the RPGs, we'd bring them home, we'd make our own characters, or at least rename the characters in the game, and then as we'd play through the game, which we usually took turns, but as we played through the games, we would act out all of the different scenes in the RPGs. So think about something like Chrono Trigger. We would voice act every single one of those characters. I was always Chrono, my brother was always Frog, by the way, just to put that out there. And Sam, if you're listening to this, which I'm sure you are, yes, I'm going to try to embarrass you throughout this episode, but we would sit down with those RPGs and we would voice act everything out. When we got Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy III at the time, but Final Fantasy VI, that was perfect for us because there were so many characters, so many scenes that we could act out. Oh my God, it was perfect. It was like Nirvana for for a couple kids that probably were trying to act well beyond our own abilities, but it was still a ton of fun. I mention all of that to say that we would rent these RPGs from time to time. And a lot of times we would get to a certain point in the game, and then unfortunately, we'd have to return the darn rental because we didn't actually own them. And that is exactly what happened with Earthbound. We played Earthbound, and I played Earthbound back when it first came out. And I still recall when Earthbound first came out and the crazy scratch and sniff advertising campaign that came along with it. And oh my God, that was pretty disgusting. By the way, I wish I kind of had one still, had something that was still active from a scratch and sniff perspective, because I want to refresh my memory. I don't remember it perfectly. I remember the event, but I do not remember what everything smelled like other than remembering that it smelled pretty darn bad. Anyway, Earthbound, when it first came out, we did not buy Earthbound. We rented it from the video rental store. We played through for a bit, and it was a really interesting game. Very different than all of the RPGs that we had played up to that point. We got up to a certain point and then we had to return it to the video rental store, and we thought, okay, fine. This is something we'll have to get in the future, but right now it's just not in the cards. Well, the next weekend, we were kind of thinking about, well, hey, what game should we rent? And we decided, let's go get Earthbound again. Earthbound was a really good game. Now, this brings up a critical issue with relying on video game rentals to try to beat an RPG, especially a longer RPG with saves and things like that. When you rent a game and you return a game, you have no guarantee that your saved game is going to be on that game when you go to rent it again. A couple of different reasons. One, a video game rental store might have a couple copies of a game and you might not get the same copy that you originally played. But secondly, there might have been some other doofus that rented it over the past week and overwrote your saved file with their own, in which case, oh, it hurts so much. So we got Earthbound the next weekend because we wanted to try to continue playing it. And of course, our save was gone. It wasn't anywhere to be found. We had to restart the game from the beginning. We probably got up to around the same spot that we did before, which I want to say is maybe, I think it was like 2 towns in. Maybe we got to the point of the bus, of getting the bus and going further into the game, but that's still pretty early in the overall experience. So then we returned it again. And at that point, I don't think we rented it again back then. And I personally didn't play Earthbound again ever since that moment back in the mid-90s until I played it for the podcast. Well, I finally resolved a multiple decades issue by sitting down and playing Earthbound for the podcast. And what I found when I sat down to play Earthbound was an incredibly charming, engaging, really well-designed RPG experience that was truly unlike other RPGs from around the time that Earthbound was made. Most of the RPGs around that time were focused on epic world-impacting events where you would get a ton of different weaponry over time. It was usually medieval-centric, so you'd get swords and shields and suits of armor, and you would go off to save the world with your party of hardened adventurers and warriors and mages and all of that kind of stuff, and you would go off to save the day. In Earthbound, you're playing a group of kids. You're walking around a bunch of suburban kinds of towns. You're getting yo-yos and baseball bats as your weapons. You're getting baseball caps as your armor. Everything about Earthbound feels different than the traditional RPG. And when you sit down to play it, you might think to yourself, well, I wonder if this is going to feel as engaging, because the stakes here, at least early on, feel much more quaint. I'll say. There are world-shaking ramifications eventually, but when you first start playing the game, things feel very quaint in comparison to playing, say, a Final Fantasy or a Chrono Trigger or any of those kinds of games. Kind of feels like you're playing a much more grounded experience with Earthbound that doesn't really have quite as much of that epic kind of feel. And you might think to yourself, I wonder if this game is actually going to be engaging. Well, let me tell you, absolutely, Earthbound is one of my favorite RPGs of all time. It's not quite, I still think that there are a couple that exceed Earthbound from around this time, a couple of Super NES era RPGs that I do hold in higher regard than Earthbound, but I can't argue the fact that Earthbound is one of the finest RPGs ever created. It is one of the most unique RPGs ever created, and it is one of those games that very quickly became a favorite of mine after I finally sat down to play it in earnest. It's not without some faults, and there are some grindy kinds of things that you have to deal with, but even there, the game gives you a certain amount of leeway and a certain amount of mechanics that help to alleviate some of that grindy kind of feel, like the ability to basically walk into enemies that you've overleveled and entirely decimate them without even having to go into a turn-based battle. That one system alone is probably enough to get Earthbound on a top X list of RPGs from around that time, because it removes so much of the tedium of going through different areas within an RPG that was very prevalent in RPGs of the time. So Earthbound, just remarkably designed, so quaint, so charming. It just felt like a warm hug to play, and I absolutely loved it. Moving on to our 4th spot on our list from this past year, we have I have a bit of a confession to make. My only experience with the Donkey Kong Country series up until just recently was just the original Donkey Kong Country, the very first Super NES game, and that was an amazing experience. We talked about Donkey Kong Country, the original, back last year, not this past year, but the very first year of the podcast, and even sitting down to play it today, I came away from it incredibly impressed, both from a design perspective, the graphics, the sound, the music, everything about that game was amazing. And up until playing Donkey Kong Country 2 for this past year of the podcast, that was my only experience with the Donkey Kong Country games. Actually, I take that back. I believe I did play Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze a few years ago. So no, I take that back. I did play some of the more modern Donkey Kong Countries, but as far as the Super NES trilogy, I only played the very first one. I've always heard that Donkey Kong Country 2 was arguably the best of the trilogy, and I started thinking to myself, there's no way. There's no way. Looking at the pictures, looking at the screenshots, looking at the different things, it's like, okay, you got rid of Donkey Kong, you replaced him with Dixie Kong. Okay, fine, whatever. Different character, probably the same mechanics. You look at the graphics, it's like, the graphics feel relatively the same as what you saw with Donkey Kong Country. You look at pretty much everything, and it felt like almost an expansion of the original Donkey Kong Country. And once again, this is looking at it from the perspective of watching or looking at static images, reading stuff about the game. Yet everybody kept saying, no, this is a better experience than Donkey Kong Country. And I will admit that I was a little bit, I didn't really believe them. Just to put it bluntly, I didn't really believe that assertion because it just looked like more of the same. Well, I was wrong. Donkey Kong Country 2 is actually much, much better than the original Donkey Kong Country. But the reason it's better will never come across just by looking at screenshots or by reading a review or by reading about the mechanics. You have to experience the game to truly understand what makes Donkey Kong Country 2 better than Donkey Kong Country. Yes, the graphics were slightly improved, and yes, the audio and music sounds as good, if not better, than the original, just because all of those songs are simply amazing. But what really makes Donkey Kong Country 2 stand out to me is the design of the platforming and the overall design of the game world, each of the levels, and the inclusion of a bunch of secrets. Donkey Kong Country was a well-designed platformer, but it was fairly linear. You kind of moved through the levels, and sure, there were some secret areas, but there weren't really any stakes associated with those secret areas. You went in, you might have gotten some additional bananas or something, or an animal companion or something like that, but otherwise, they're just kind of there in levels, kind of like the secret areas in the original Super Mario Bros., where you might go down a pipe, and your only reward for doing that might be to skip ahead a little bit in a level or get some additional coins. Occasionally you'd get the warp zone, which is pretty darn nice. But outside of that, they were pretty much just straightforward little hidden secrets that just added a little bit of flavor to the overall experience. Those were the kind of things that were in Donkey Kong Country. Donkey Kong Country 2 doubles down on that by giving you the start of what I guess would be Rare's collectathon period, where Rare would create games that had tons of different collectibles and collection things that you'd have to acquire over the course of a playthrough, some of which would unlock additional content, others were just there to kind of act as an achievement of sorts for people playing the game. But from my perspective, the fact that each of these levels in Donkey Kong Country 2 had so many hidden secrets to discover, and you had to discover those secrets in order to get to the true ending of the game and the true final world of the game. That fact made Donkey Kong Country 2 feel dramatically bigger and higher stakes than the original. It's like the first Donkey Kong Country was kind of the equivalent of the original Super Mario Bros. And Donkey Kong Country 2 was the equivalent of, it's not really the equivalent of like a Super Mario 3 because Super Mario 3 vastly evolved over the original Super Mario. But you can kind of think of it in a similar kind of vein, and that Donkey Kong Country 2 truly did evolve the formula that was originally set forth in the original Donkey Kong Country. The secrets were great, the level design was superb, and I don't think there were any levels. I'm trying to think now. I don't think there were any levels in Donkey Kong Country 2 where I thought, oh, great, just another of these kind of levels. I mean, sure, there were levels that shared themes, but every single level had new mechanics that built on top of one another. Every single level was filled with whimsy and just a magical sense of discovery, both from a secret perspective, as well as trying to figure out how best to apply the new mechanics that the game would introduce every single level to actually beat those levels. The original had that same kind of thing, but Donkey Kong Country 2 actually exceeded every aspect of the original Donkey Kong Country. It is, by far, one of the best platforming games ever made, and I have no reservations with saying that. Now, I've never played Donkey Kong Country 3. I'm not sure if we'll play it for this podcast or not. I've heard that it's not quite as good as the first two, or at least not as good as the second one. That doesn't mean anything because I love playing all sorts of games, but I will say with absolute certainty, regardless of whether I play Donkey Kong Country 3, Donkey Kong Country 2 is a remarkable achievement in video game design, and it is by far one of my favorite platformers of all time, which is why it is now at number 4 in our list of Pantheon entries from the past year. We're about to crack the top 3 Pantheon entries from this past year, and number 3 is... Remember earlier when I mentioned that Day of the Tentacle was one of the finest point-and-click adventure games ever made, but that there were a few that, from my perspective, actually exceeded its quality? Well, Broken Sword Shadow of the Templars is one of those games. I loved Broken Sword Shadow of the Templars. That's the very first Broken Sword game in the series, or Circle of Blood, depending on where in the world you live. But that game, oh my God, is it so good. When I sat down, and this is another one, by the way, that my brother and I played back when we were younger. This is one of my brother's games, so this is one that he was controlling. We never really got that far in the game, to be honest with you. I don't know why that is. We sat down, we played it for a couple times, and then we never really went back to it back then. But this was one of his that he was controlling, and regardless of that fact, we just never, I don't know if it didn't click with us, or we were kind of feeling, I think, more Indiana Jonesy at the time, and this didn't really feel Indiana Jonesy. So we kind of said, we'll put it off to the side and maybe go off and play something else. Regardless, when I sat down to play Broken Sword for the first time in earnest, back when I was doing the Point and Click podcast, because this is another one that I first played for the Point and Click podcast, I remember being blown away by everything associated with the game. The music, the graphics, which were awesomely cartoon styled, highly detailed. Every single scene in the game looked amazing. And one of the things that I particularly enjoyed, well, there were a couple things, but one of the things I particularly enjoyed was the dialogue system. And I know it's kind of weird to talk about a dialogue system as being something that actually makes you feel like a game is even better than other games. But in Broken Sword, it's absolutely true, because the way it worked, rather than having a bunch of text options that you could pick from and dialogue trees that you'd have to navigate, in Broken Sword, everything in the dialogue system was represented by an icon, which represented kind of an idea or an inventory item or anything else that could be represented as a graphical icon of what you want to ask about. You didn't know exactly what you would ask when you clicked one of those icons, but you knew that it was going to be something about that idea or concept. What makes Broken Sword special, because it's not the first time that kind of thing happened, there was a similar kind of setup in Sam and Max Hit the Road, where you'd have icons versus text-based dialogue trees. The thing that made Broken Sword absolutely crazy is that every single idea, concept, item in the game, you could ask literally every single person in the game, and they would have a specific response for that item, idea, or concept. Meaning, there were none of the kinds of traditional adventure game responses like, I don't know anything about that would repeat ad nauseum as you would go down a list of dialogue topics with a particular character. In Broken Sword, every single character had responses, meaningful responses to every single item, which was crazy, but made the game feel so much more alive, so much more integrated than the majority of adventure games that had ever been released, and honestly, that have been released since that point. Broken Sword did so much with that dialogue system. I just remember feeling it just felt amazing to experience something that had that level of care and attention and detail applied to it, such that you could ask somebody in the late game about a soggy tissue that you picked up in a sewer early in the game, and they would actually have a unique response about that item. Absolutely crazy to me, and one of those things that I think makes Broken Sword a unique experience. Beyond that, though, the overall story was phenomenal. The way that you would experience the story felt like a cinematic kind of film. This was not the kind of game with a lot of different overarching, highly complex puzzles. This was almost trying to create or recreate an experience of a cinematic adventure kind of experience. And I thought it executed on every aspect of that experience with perfection. Broken Sword is one of my favorite adventure games of all time, and it is not a surprise that it comes in as number 3 on our list of Pantheon games from the past year. Moving on to the top 2. This is where it gets real. Our top 2 entry is... I'm going to wager that the fact that The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time did not take the top listing in our Pantheon over this past year is likely a surprise to many of you. And to be honest with you, it's a little bit of a surprise to me for many different reasons. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, perhaps more than any other game that we've looked at, is a truly revolutionary release. It both popularized and showed people how to do 3D gaming the right way. For the most part, I mean, it does show its age a little bit, but think about concepts like Z-targeting, horseback travel, and mounted combat, and a bunch of other things, and it's not hard to see why The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time is still widely considered to be one of the best games of all time, and I have to agree with that sentiment. I absolutely love The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. I loved it when it first came out, I loved it when I replayed it several years after that, and I loved it when I played it for this podcast. It is quite frankly a seminal release in video and computer game history, and it deserves every single accolade that it has ever gotten. From the music, to the gameplay, to the dungeons with all of the puzzles that are in there, and the combat. Oh my god. Zelda Ocarina of Time, or The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, is definitely one of the best games of all time. It's not our top entry though. And this is one that absolutely surprised me. And I could talk on and on about Ocarina of Time, about how the progression of Link from young Link to older Link and how the world changes makes for a dynamic environment, to all of the different enemies that you encounter that require different combat mechanics in order to beat, to the different items that are there. Oh my god, I can't. Ocarina of Time is a landmark game, but it is not our top game from this past year. Our top game from this past year truly surprised me. It is an experience that I had never played before. And now that I have played it, I have a brand new respect for the work that went into creating that title. So, for the past year of the podcast, year 2 of Classic Gaming Today, our top Pantheon entry is... Monkey Island 2: LeChuck's Revenge. I was so pleasantly surprised when I played this game. I had never played it before. I had played The Secret of Monkey Island several times, not in full. I played The Secret of Monkey Island in full for the first time for my Point and Click podcast. Then I played it again as part of year 2 of this podcast, and then ISO sponsored Monkey Island 2: LeChuck's Revenge as a Patreon episode, and I said, you know what? Obviously, I'm going to play that because I'm contractually obligated to, but beyond that, I was curious. How would The Secret of Monkey Island evolve into Monkey Island 2: LeChuck's Revenge? I had heard from so many people that Monkey Island 2 was an even better game than its predecessor. I was excited. I also heard that the ending, a little bit of a cliffhanger there, and I was a little curious. I'm like, what could it be? And somehow, I had remained spoiler-free for the last, 30 years? Something like that. I didn't know what the ending was. I just knew that there was some sort of cliffhanger. So I went into the game entirely blind. And let me tell you, I had such a good time with Monkey Island 2. Everything about that game was nearly perfect. The puzzle design, the way all of the puzzles built on one another and intersected into something that was truly phenomenal. The difficulty and challenge of the puzzles, where the solutions were mostly logical without being overly logical, meaning there was a lot of difficulty there. The observation that you had to have within the environment in order to solve some of those puzzles, some of which I am still kicking myself for not solving myself. Oh, that darn spitting puzzle. I should have gotten that. If anybody goes back to listen to that episode again, I had critique around the spitting puzzle. And then ISO posted out on Discord and said, hey, there are some clues here that you might have missed. And I looked back and, darn it, that ISO was right. There's stuff there. I should have caught it. But that just means that this game is even more perfect because every single puzzle could be figured out if you were observational enough, if you paid enough attention, if you were good enough. You could beat that entire game without ever consulting a walkthrough. I think I used a walkthrough, twice in there. I still maintain, by the way, that the one section near the end of the game where a certain action that you could take earlier in the game totally changes later in the game, and I'm not giving any spoilers, obviously. I still maintain that was not the cleanest design and also caused me to not really think about things the right way at one portion of the late game sequences. But regardless of that fact, Monkey Island 2 has quickly become one of, if not, and I'm going to say it, might be my favorite adventure game of all time. At this point, Monkey Island 2 was a phenomenal achievement in adventure gaming. It is one of those games where if you are a true adventure game aficionado and you haven't played Monkey Island 2, what are you doing? I had to ask myself that same exact question. What have I been doing with my life to have not played Monkey Island 2 before this past year? I am so happy that I have rectified that issue. And thank you, ISO, for sponsoring that episode because it forced me to play it. And in the process, I discovered something that was truly special and is our top Pantheon entry from year 2 of Classic Gaming Today. That was our episode focused on ranking our Year 2 Pantheon entries. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there's a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Rare's torture simulator, Battletoads, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible content I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you to make sure I am hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow our community and continue to deliver the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Battletoads. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.